Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's event. To submit a question or comment at any time during the webcast, please click on the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the Submit button. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Jim Christie. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on corporate culture and the role of boards. We have formally titled this program, The Board's Role in Defining, Communicating, and Sustaining Corporate Culture, What Directors Need to Know. I am Jim Christie, editor of Directors and Boards, and I will be assisted today by my two colleagues, Scott Chase and David Shaw. You will hear Dave Shaw teeing up your questions as we get into the presentation. A couple housekeeping items. The webinar will run for 1 hour, ending sharp at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Questions may be submitted at any time, and we will get to as many as we can during this hour. And if some questions are still left unanswered, they will be addressed in a follow-up form. The webinar will be posted to the Directors and Boards website, and the presentation materials will be emailed to all registrants after the webinar. There are materials that are available for immediate downloading. You will find them in the Materials tab right next to the Ask a Question button. This webinar is sponsored by Diligent. Diligent is the leading provider of secure corporate governance and collaboration solutions for boards and senior executives, and we're happy to have Diligent sponsor the webinar today. For today's discussion, we have three co-leaders. I'll give you a brief bio note on each, and their fuller bios are available on the registration site. Mary Beth Vitale is a board member of CoBiz Financial Inc., a financial holding company headquartered in Denver. She is a faculty member of the National Association of Corporate Directors Board Advisory Services and founder and chairman of the NACD's Colorado chapter. She is also one of the 2016 Directors to Watch in our class that we just announced in the annual report issue of Directors and Boards. Eileen Schreiber-Radis is a senior manager in Deloitte Consulting's human capital area. Her expertise is in change management, strategy, operations, and technology. And we're happy to have both Eileen and Mary Beth join us. And Jeffrey Hilk is Executive Vice President and Chief Revenue Officer for Diligent Corp. Among his responsibilities in this role are scaling the growth and efficiency of Diligent's global sales organization and driving a winning sales culture that is aligned with Diligent's strong focus on customer success. As I say, more detailed bios of our webinar leaders are on the registration site. So let's get today's webinar underway. Jeff, let me hand it over to you to start the discussion.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks to everyone on the call today. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Diligent is very proud to sponsor another webinar with the Directors and Boards. As mentioned, Diligent provides the world's most widely used board portal, used by hundreds of thousands of governance professionals, and I'm sure we've got some folks on the call today who are Diligent users, and we thank you for your business, and if you're not a Diligent user, we'd love to talk to you about being one. As I'm sure you're all aware, it's important for us to work with organizations like Directors and Boards to provide ongoing discussions around topics that matter to the board's community, which brings us to today's conversation about the board's role in defining, communicating, sustaining corporate culture, specifically how a strong culture of ethics and compliance can positively impact a company's long-term value creation. So before we dive into some presentations, to get things going, we thought we'd have a quick poll to gauge where you all think corporate culture stands within your own organizations. And two questions. There's two questions that are going to appear on your screen. We'd like to take them one at a time and actually ask you to respond to the poll, and we'll share the results of that with everyone. First question here is, how important is a robust corporate culture in defining the goals, missions, and chances for success of a company? And if you can select either very important, important, not very important, or not at all important. And we'll give you a few seconds to do that and then tabulate the results.
Okay, I have stopped the poll at this point, and I'm about to show the results of the first question. 81% said very important, 19% important, and nobody gave it less importance than that. So 81% and 19%.
Okay, so that is, I guess, understandable if while you're on the call today that you feel that that robust corporate culture has a high level of importance. Second question here: how strong would you say your corporate culture is right now? And the answers can be very strong, but it could be better, not strong at all, or virtually non-existent. And we'll give you a few seconds to answer that poll. David, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I am stopping the poll, and the results are coming up. 13% said very strong, 72% said strong but could be better, and 15% said not strong at all. No one said virtually non-existent.
Okay, so good feedback. I guess what the message there is that we have room for improvement in this area. So thank you for all of you that participated in the poll for that information. So let's get the conversation started. I'm going to ask to hand things over to Mary Beth, who will provide us with insights from the NACD.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. I thought we would really start this off with what is corporate culture. And I think if you just narrow it down, it's just how do you do things in a particular organization? How do you act and how do you behave? What things are important to the organization? What are traditions they have it? And NACD does the top point here on the social norms is a formal definition of it, but I think they've got a great paper called Defining Corporate Culture that if you're a member of NACD, you can pick that up. It's April 2015. It'll give you more broadly a definition, and it goes into a lot of depths of how to identify it. But I think when you look at it as a board member, it's do you have board dinners the night before? Do you have assigned seats when you're in the boardroom? This is all the culture, good or bad. It's what the culture is. Does the chair and the lead director always make sure everyone is asked their opinion? Are they respectful in the boardroom of each other? Is anyone rolling their eyes, which would indicate maybe not such a great culture in the boardroom? And I think, you can ask the question, why does it matter? So it comes from the top down, and as the board, how you are treated, how you do things, then permeates through the rest of the organization. And why it matters is that if you look at here on the slide, we talk about that it can reduce employee misconduct, increase customer satisfaction, and I think that goes back to if the board treats one another with respect and asks opinions and thoughts, then it should flow down throughout the organization that you're respectful of your customers, you're respectful of your coworkers, and that the employees are treated with respect from management. And as a result, that increases employee engagement and productivity. Does your organization have a culture of giving back to the community? Is that something that's part of your culture? And I think especially here, when we talk about innovation and idea sharing really is of how you keep a competitive advantage within your organization. So is there a safe environment to bring ideas, open to change, and what's the attitude about it? And some ideas are good and some ideas are bad, but you don't want to miss that golden idea that could be in there. And then lastly on this particular page is, regulators definitely, their antennas are up about emphasizing and scrutinizing the strength of the corporate culture. So they feel that corporate culture has a direct correlation to the tone at the top. And when you look at the tone at the top, how the decisions are being made. Are they black and white decisions? Does management go into the gray area, which can lead to problems? And that's where the regulators are getting involved. And I think that we're going to see more of that in the days and years to come. So if you could switch to the next slide. So does the corporate culture affect shareholder value? So when you look at pure research right now, it's really mixed. However, I really think that we're going to find more and more data points that point to, yes, it does really affect it. We've got the millennials now are in our organizations at entry level and maybe mid-level management at this time, and their culture of themselves is different. The culture of an organization is more important to them than maybe the dollars they get. They want to work for an organization that values team building, that places value on family, that you get time off to do charity work. They want to work together to solve problems. They're not a standalone generation. And if you as an organization want to attract the brightest and most talented individuals for your organization's future, you need to make sure you've got a culture that really attracts them. And they really look at that. And I think a prime example that was in the papers maybe about 8-9 months ago of maybe a culture that wasn't a positive culture is Amazon. And Amazon has a very high turnover. Even though they're a successful corporation at the moment, they have an unhealthy competitive environment among pitting each employee against that. And as a result, they have high turnover, and people are leaving and going to other organizations that have a culture that they can relate to as millennials. So I think it definitely affects shareholder value, and it will increase as our millennials get into higher-level management positions, that they're just not going to work for a company that doesn't value what they value. So if we could move to the next slide. This one starts with talking about the tone at the top on the next slide. And so what is tone at the top? I think you look at it, it's the ethical behavior and of the board and of senior management. So as a board member, we've got 3 or 4 main responsibilities, and I view the number one responsibility is to hire, to fire, to compensate, to evaluate the CEO as one of the main responsibilities of the board. And with that comes the tone at the top, and it goes all the way through the organization. But as a subset of that, at Cobus Financial, I chair the Nominating and Governance Committee. It's important that you hire the board members when you're looking at the compensation and the skills that you need. That are they cultural fit? Do they have the same values of the organization? So part and parcel, the board members as well as the CEO of the decision you made there to hire and fire and evaluate and compensate them is critical for the tone at the top. So, and again, it permeates throughout the organization. And believe me, you would be naive to think that the mid-level management does not see how the board behaves. They know what is going on in many instances, so it's important that you are aligned there. So why is this setting the tone at the top difficult? And I think there's 4 bullet points here that kind of describe what can happen. And I think the first one talks about the pressure to deliver short-term results. And that has always been a case it sometimes relies in the audit committee role in terms of the press release in delivering the quarterly results and what the future is. But I think that this is going to start to change a little bit. About 3-4 months ago, BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, sent out a letter to the CEOs of the Fortune 500. And they're a huge institutional investor in most companies. And if you look at most companies that are publicly traded, about 80% of their shares are held by institutions, not on the street. And when you look at this, what Larry said is that quarterly earnings hysteria in terms of trying to deliver to that is really bad for business. He's an investor in long-term value creation, and he thinks that that is really important. It's not look from quarter to quarter. And so as more institutions get onto that bandwagon and not demand these quarterly results, I think that will take one of those things off of the table here in terms of the difficulty in creating the tone at the top. And I think another area that comes into play is that management does not necessarily receive training on how to develop ethical leaders throughout their organization. And I think it's hard, a subset of this, it's hard for board members to find out, okay, what is the culture in the organization? And I think there's two ways here that this can happen for the board members to understand this. You need to be doing site visits. You need to be talking to not just the senior executive team that presents to the board, but going down levels. With a bank board that I sit on, talk to the teller. Find out how things are going. I mean, you will find out, you'll get a better idea of what the culture is within the organization, and is it in sync with the tone at the top. The other thing is HR, the head of HR for that organization. Are they part of the board committee role in the compensation? Because they're a perfect senior executive that can help with the development of ethical behavior throughout the organization. So where they reside, if they're just a person that makes sure payroll gets out, that may not be the right type of HR skill set that you need, and to have that person in the boardroom with you to help. Another thing that comes into play is if you do business across the globe, and all of you know about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. For U.S.-based companies, it may offer some challenges, but doing the right thing and not just what is legal is probably, if you go with that motto, that can help. And there may be some strategy changes you need to make if your culture doesn't align with the countries you want to do business with. And lastly, I think, and this one is so topical right now, is ethical behavior is often not integrated into performance objectives. And front page of the newspaper the last couple of days, we saw Wells Fargo in the newspaper because of their incentive plan had unintended consequences of their incentive plan of wanting to make sure there was 8 relationships and your bonuses was based on that. The board and the comp committee sets the compensation for the CEO, and that trickles down throughout the organization, as well as approving the budget for going forward. And this is where it's critical to make sure that you're not approving an incentive plan that has unintended consequences. Because right now, Wells is facing a $185 million fine. The CEO is going to be testifying in front of Congress. You're going to have, as a result, there probably will be more regulatory issues that come up. And so it's not there's consequences when you don't have that alignment, and it's really important from the culture standpoint. And I know, Eileen, that you've got some comments you'd like to share as it comes to compensation and performance rewards.
Thank you, Mary Beth. The Deloitte methodology and how we work with our clients on assessing and adjusting their culture to drive business strategy is really anchored in 3 things that echo what you talked about around how leaders are embodying and demonstrating the behaviors that anchor the culture, how the key processes reflect the culture choices made, and then how talent management, or as you mentioned, HR, reflect the culture. So from a board perspective, that modeling of leadership behaviors, embodying the cultural dimensions is absolutely critical for management as well as for the board. For key processes, the board influences or leads some of the most strategic and critical processes for organizations today. And when I think of things like the budgeting process and reviewing annual budgets or participating in any sort of financials review, that's a great opportunity to take a look at the process itself and review how to further entrench the culture choices into that process. And then finally, with regards to HR, Mary Beth talked a lot about sort of some of the compensation choices. And compensation, performance management, succession planning, those are all really core talent management processes that the board plays a role in, and can use that as an opportunity to further reinforce the culture.
Those are great points, Eileen. I appreciate that. If we could go to the next slide. This is okay. So, what does the strong tone at the top look like? How do you know? You usually know when it's not good, but how do you know when it's good? And there are some functional types of things that you can see, but then there's things that really are intuitive in that. And so I think the first thing when you look at functional is, how is it communicated, the tone at the top, and consistent enforcement of ethical standards. And I think what this ends up being is, are you doing employee satisfaction surveys? Are you doing customer satisfaction surveys? Are there ethical questions embedded in that? And the board needs to ask for those results to know how is the company functioning from a cultural standpoint. And then also making sure that there's accountability when there are maybe ethical or cultural failures. And that, obviously, the rubber meets the road on that, and when something like that happens. However, when you do have a crisis of this such, sometimes you'll find out that your culture was working. And I'll give you an example that I experienced. In one of the boards I sat on, I was chair of the audit committee, and we had an internal investigation. The CEO had called me that they had discovered an employee had embezzled from the company. And I think what the critical point is as we went through the process and I led the internal investigation, was the fact that this was through a whistleblower, and the culture was of such that the whistleblower felt comfortable enough, not necessarily using the whistleblower hotline, but went to their immediate supervisor and said, look, this doesn't make sense. I think something's wrong here. And as a result, she was praised for bringing it. Everyone knew she was recognized positively, not negatively, for doing that. And as a result, they were able, it was a low-level employee who had identified, it was an administrative person who identified some issues, had the courage, and there was an environment, a cultural environment that was positive to be able to bring that to her immediate supervisor. And then from there, it went through the process. And I think through that whole process, management never blamed, didn't point the finger. They wanted to find the facts and data. And I think that really, and they said the buck stops here. And so from a aspect of knowing whether the culture was a positive culture, it really helped in this area. And to know that it was working well and we just needed to reinforce it. And so I don't know, Eileen, if you've got any ideas from an auditing standpoint of what Deloitte, how they look at it when an ethical or cultural failure emerges, or whether from a restatement that you want to make any comment on.
Mary Beth, I would echo the importance of quickly engaging the individuals or the groups that raise the issue and being as transparent as possible in highlighting that that's the desired behavior. I worked with a multinational life sciences organization as within their R&D group, as they were recognizing that they were receiving warning letters for issues in their clinical trials. And part of the root cause was that folks weren't confident that if they raised their hand when they saw issues, that there wouldn't be retribution. And as a result, it resulted in misdosing and the warning letters. And we worked with them to make sure that leaders were demonstrating that transparency and encouraging the escalation of issues. And we refined the processes so that just the day-to-day ways of working would encourage that escalation. And really, in doing so, we're able to see a significant reduction in ultimate errors. And so kind of the seeing it all the way through from upfront identification of the issue through achieving value at the end.
That's a great example, because I really think that if you've created a safe environment that allows for transparency, allows for somebody to say, gee, this doesn't smell right, I'm not sure, but it creates that environment. And you just gave an example of what happens when it wasn't there, that they miss an opportunity of correcting something sooner than later. And I think that says a lot. So I think, culture does play a key role in helping achieve the strategy. They were looking at new product development, et cetera. So could we go to the next slide, which will be my last slide here? So what's the board's role here? And I've talked a little bit about that already, but NACD did a survey, and 37% of boards assessed the health of the company's culture over the last 12 months, which that's a great start, but there's a high risk here. And, we as board members are always addressing risk, but many boards don't put culture as a risk. And it's not in the ERM document, and you're not looking at that of a risk. It's usually not on agendas. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, but it obviously needs to be more top of mind. So what can the board do to review this? So I think one is making sure it gets on the agenda to at least have a discussion. We talk about the incentiving the right behaviors. Obviously, the Wells Fargo issue is that, but you've got regulatory issues that, starting back with SOX, which was trying to legislate the right behavior from financial reporting, and then to Dodd-Frank, which is trying to legislate ethics with clawbacks and pay ratios. So you've got some regulatory issues that are out there that will raise this to a level. I think number two we look at is to assess that. So what are the relevant indicators about the employee surveys are great, conducting the site visits I talked about. Are they comfortable? Eileen just talked about, speaking up about the problem. So I think, and a lot of times it's important to look at the whistleblower complaints. All those of you who are audit chairs on the call here, I'm sure that you look at your whistleblower, and many times it has nothing to do with financial reporting, because that's how that was put in place. It tends to be a lot of HR issues. My boss is a jerk, he or she doesn't come in on time or whatever, but monitoring that, even though their HR issues, are a telling sign. If there's a particular individual that always has some complaint on it, you need to start addressing that there's a culture or there's an issue there. So it's important that the board is looking at those complaints and not just saying, well, it's not a financial reporting issue, I'll just let HR handle it. I think not. I think it's important for us to at least make sure that it's been, resolved or hunted down in terms of that. And last, we talk about the boardroom culture allowing the concerns to surface. So, yes, you want to have a collegial board, but that's why independence is important, that you feel comfortable. Is it transparent in the boardroom? Are you able to, if an M&A transaction maybe going down the road and one person doesn't feel comfortable, if they keep quiet and don't feel that they can raise that, a lot of bad things can possibly happen. And I think it's really important in the boardroom that, you're all in a boat together, and you want to make sure that the guns are pointing in the right direction and not at each other. So we go back to the board's role, and that is making sure that the tone at the top, you've hired the right CEO for the culture that you want to achieve the strategy that you have in place. So I think that those are thoughts that I think you can chew on for a while, and we'll come back if there's questions. And I'm going to turn it over now to Eileen, and she's going to talk about some of the slides they have through their the research that they've done. And a lot of these will be reinforced of what I just said, so that's good that it kind of dovetails together. Eileen?
Mary Beth, before you completely move on, I had a question from the audience, and this is related to CEO compensation ratios, and especially the upcoming reporting that's going to be done on that. Do you think that will have a negative impact on culture, and is that something the board can manage?
Well, it could possibly. I think it's important that the CEO and the board communicates well, because sometimes those the ratios for each industry tells a different story. So, it's not like it's a fail-safe. If you're working for a company that's heavily with international globally, or if you have lots of customer service, that's your business. So the executives have a high salary, and then you've got a lot of hourly wage employees in there. It's going to skew the results. So I think it's really imperative upon the board to ensure that management is communicating when we have to do those reporting on the pay ratio there, because it is going to show different things for different industries, and it can cause a lot of angst in the company. But it sometimes calls on the management when, if the average pay is X for your position and you're not in that average pay, you're in the lower end, you may want to, HR is going to have to deal with people coming to them saying, well, why aren't I paid, in the median level? So it will be challenged, and I think communicating, and it goes back to transparency, is so important to be able to make sure employees understand, and that it also may give management some data to make some changes. Maybe there are changes that need to be made. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I agree with Mary Beth that the slides that we're going to go through next from Deloitte are ones that build upon some of the key concepts and insights that Mary Beth shared. So I will be efficient with our time and try not to be too redundant, but we wanted to start with the definition of culture, and this really resonates with how Mary Beth outlined how she defines culture, and really it comes down to the ways of working, the system of behaviors, values, and beliefs that influences how work gets done. And at Deloitte, we look at culture on kind of two sets of indices. So to bring it to life, there's core indices that are kind of the foundational cultural elements, the strategic choices that define success. So this is stuff like collective focus on collaboration and teaming, on risk and governance, including compliance and quality, on external orientation, how much are we looking out versus just looking in, and then finally change and innovation. How open are we as an organization to evolve and innovate? The differentiating indices is how we define those aspects of culture, are those that measure the emotional connectedness. And our recent research highlights just how important that emotional connectedness is to today's workforce, especially with the millennials. And so these differentiating indices, which includes things like courage, commitment, inclusion, and shared beliefs, are ones that really are opportunities to distinguish performance for an organization. So with that sort of how we define culture, I want to look at the data that supports why this is so important. And I love the polling questions that we opened with, because it reinforces that this audience has very similar perspectives and may even be doubling down even farther on culture than the national research we did. But we found that the data tells a story that culture is important, it's underserved, but it needs to be a priority going forward. So as we see, 86% of executives surveyed rated culture as very important or important. And this audience of leaders indicated about 81% as very important. 18 is important. So even more of an emphasis from this group. The other point that I would highlight is that, while it's important, it's not as much of a focus. There's a lower percentage of leaders that believe it's the focus on the right amount or that it's the right culture. So we're looking at about 12% of leaders believing that their organizations are currently driving to the right culture. And I think that correlates pretty well with the question that this audience responded to that indicated that about 13% believe culture is very strong, where there's still about 72% that indicated that there's room for improvement. So the data definitely tells the story. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see, and that the media has told the story as well, that culture is all over the news. Culture is integrated into how organizations reflect their health and report on their overall health versus just reporting on their financial health. Organizations understand the positive correlation between business results and strong culture. And Mary Beth, you mentioned that the data is mixed. In our latest research, we outline the findings that highlight that correlation between positive results and strong corporate culture. And there's actually a resource that I'd love for folks to take a look at following this call that is recent literature we published called Taking Your Culture Off Cruise Control. And that's where some of the data is expanded or expounded upon. So the data proves it, and we're seeing it echoed in the media through our corporate leaders. Let me highlight on the next slide kind of what our view is on how you shape it. The foundation is that culture drives strategy. So culture needs to be aligned with your business strategy. If you say that patients or members for healthcare leaders are critical to your strategy, and enhancing the experience for them is critical to growing market share, increasing revenue, whatever the metric is that you're looking to improve, the culture you're cultivating needs to anchor in the patient or the member. Next, culture is shaped by leadership actions and behaviors and decisions. Mary Beth talked a lot about how the tone from the top is really critical to shaping culture. And we found that the role of the board, it could vary based on the size or type of the organization. So the smaller privately held organization's board may really be shaping the culture, really be framing it out and holding leaders accountable in a very detailed, hands-on way, versus the larger organizational boards may more influence, model behaviors, and raise questions. So the note here is that leaders drive the culture, and that the boards play a critical role, and it may vary based on size. Next, culture is sustained by employee behavior, actually how that culture, those cultural tenets translate to what your employees do and what they're incented and held accountable to do. And then finally, it's reinforced by business and organizational systems. So I talked earlier about how important it is to review your key processes and your HR practices so that they reinforce what you're trying to drive. I'm sure that many of those on the call heard the very exciting news that Deloitte expanded their leave policies so that associates are able to care for family in an extended way. And this is definitely an initiative from our company to try to reinforce through an HR process, right, that it is absolutely critical that we're taking care of the well-being of our people, because that is a core strategic priority for the firm. So just wanted to highlight that as an example that I assume that our board was very active in discussing with firm leadership as a strategic choice to make. The next
Eileen, a question that might be relevant right here from the audience. There seems to be growing sentiment that strategy drives culture. While I agree, what are your thoughts on this?
Most definitely, and if without an intentional review of your culture to really assess if it is aligned with strategy, there's data that proves that the strategy will be suboptimized. I mean, M&A is the best example to highlight how that has historically happened. And the data that we found is that 1 in 3 companies identified issues with cultural integration as a primary cause of failure of achieving their stated transition objectives with M&A. 1 in 3. And so M&A may have been a key strategic priority for an organization, but without mindfully managing culture through it, the value of that transaction is suboptimized.
Well, also I think there's a saying out there, culture will eat strategy for lunch. We've heard that before, and I think it really is so true that if your culture doesn't align with the strategy you have 2 choices, change the culture or change the strategy in order for that company to be successful and making sure that your culture is aligned with the strategy. So you guys are right on that.
Definitely. So we've spent a good amount of time talking through the role of the board and some of the insights that Mary Beth, you highlighted. So I don't want to be too redundant here, but I do think it's important to highlight sort of the role of the board in shaping expectations of culture to drive strategy, really the behaviors, the trust in management, the investment in identifying and holding leaders accountable, as Mary Beth outlined, setting the tone for strategy, and really the expectations. So I keep coming back to, but I think that annual budgeting cycle is such a powerful one to use as kind of staying close to management and driving the right accountabilities around culture through such a critical process. Mary Beth, anything on strategy that you want to highlight before we go to kind of the questions the board can ask?
Yeah, I think there's an example that maybe the people on the call will resonate with when the culture does get in the way of strategy in a negative way is that, Walmart, their strategy was to get involved more heavily in distribution in Mexico. Even though the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was alive and well, management or the incentives, whatever the case may be, they ignored that. And as a result, you have global relationships damaged because of that, fines assessed to them because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So here, the culture that was in place, whether it was the culture just in Mexico or the culture for Walmart all over, really played a part in them not being able to achieve a strategic initiative that they had. Even though regulatory rules were in place, it's very difficult to, legislate ethics, and that was the result.
Great example. That's a great example, and really a good segue to these questions that I think board members can keep close to their heart as they think about sort of really shaping the culture, and it looks at sort of, does the organization have a defined set of values, and are we seeing those played out? Am I seeing those come to life? When I walk through the door of an organization, are the employees that greet me living those behaviors as I interface with them? And then, how are we what is the vision for collective focus, for collaboration, for teaming, and what's the focus on the customers? And I used the customer example a little earlier. The board plays an absolutely critical role. And in closing, I would just like to highlight the next slide that looks at sort of some of the trends and insights that we've found. First, highlighting that leaders are using data, and culture too often is a amorphous, soft topic. And what we found to be most successful is when we can get a tangible view of what it is. So how do we gather the right data to be able to profile the desired culture to drive strategy and the hard reality of what current culture is, and be able to understand what that data looks like across business divisions, across geographies, and really understand where there's best practices that are happening in pockets of the organization that we can elevate up more broadly, or where there's differences that really need to be standardized across the global, across the complex matrixed organization. So those are just a few of the trends that we've been seeing as it relates to culture. But in the interest of time, I want to hand over to Jeff so that we can transition to the next section for the presentation.
Well, thank you, Eileen. I've got a couple slides here that can give us some additional color from a study that was done by the UK's Financial Reporting Council. There's a good deal in here that is somewhat, I'll say, it's just, I don't want to say repetitive, but supportive of the things that Mary Beth and Eileen have been talking about. So I won't go into a lot of detail on some of these slides, and I'm also, in the interest of time, I want to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for any questions the audience may have. So I might go through these very quickly. But just interestingly enough, my perspective on this, being a senior manager at Diligent and having the opportunity to work with our board of directors, both when we were a public company and as a private company, I can give personal opinion that the corporate culture within the board definitely drives employee culture down to the middle management and on. So anyway, the UK Financial Reporting Council was exploring the relationship between corporate culture and the long-term business success of some of the country's largest companies, and particularly within the framework of a continuous focus on culture. And this was sparked by a number of high-profile corporate failings and scandals, some, for instance, like at Volkswagen, that were attributed to poor behavior and bad behavior due to the culture of the organization. So the FRC saw the need to really start from the ground up on what can be done to rebuild trust in business. The key observations, which you see on the screen, are not surprising. The value of culture, demonstration of leadership, accountability, and so on are findings that the strong culture will endure in times of stress and mitigate with the impact of a crisis. Their main observations are also in line with what Mary Beth and Eileen have been discussing. So as you can see here. Delving deeper into a few of these points, though, the purpose, strategy, and business model, it goes without saying that a clear purpose is needed. They talked about strategy and why the company exists and what it's there to do as a starting point for a successful company, and is closely tied to culture. The purpose also needs to be aligned with the company's business model. Boards and execs need to have a clear understanding of how the decisions that they make impact the company's culture and help it deliver on its purpose. There's really no one size fits all. What matters, though, is that the board understand the culture of the company and what it wants to deliver on strategically, and have alignment there. In terms of the role of the board, the two previous speakers already touched upon. Selection and performance management, the CEO role is crucial. Boards have to hold executives accountable, and where they find misalignment with the company's purpose and values. I thought an interesting one that was discussed before was, in and around culture around M&A discussions. Here at Diligent, we've been involved in a number of successful M&A and activity, and have other M&A activity underway. And anytime, we aren't asking the question about whether or not culture is a fit here, is a mistake. We need to make sure that any acquisition activity is that we're assessing the culture of the acquiring a company that may be acquired, and assessing if it's the right culture that aligns well with ours. And it's a question, quite frankly, the board should be asking of senior management in their evaluation of it. The chairman, of course, specifically has a role to ensure that the non-executive directors have sufficient knowledge of business operations to challenge management effectively. And again, that the chairman is setting the right tone inside the boardroom, that these types of discussions can be had and should be had. On the next slide, it's not enough to just adopt the values in order to have an impact on behavioral outcomes. It needs to be translated into expected behaviors. It needs to be widely and consistently communicated. I think was talked earlier about codes of ethics and various surveys and site visits and so forth. Obviously the recruitment, performance management, and reward process of senior management is a big part of this, and of course integrating it into the different functions and the processes and operations in the business. This is really where middle management can come into play. It's where the focus gets pushed down within the organizations. The middle management are really the champions out there in the field that are communicating the strategy and the ideas to ensure business success. And as was mentioned earlier, investment in training, early and often, is going to bring about the right embedded culture. And so, lastly, do I have one more slide? Oh, how could board? Yes. So the measurement of all of this. So. Being a sales guy and previous that an engineer at one point in my life, I always think to metrics and how can you measure these successes. And I know that Mary Beth talked before about employee surveys and conducting site visits, and Eileen was talking about how can data be gathered so that this can be measured, and obviously no one size fits all, but I think if you as a board if you can measure culture and sit down and think about how what are the metric points you're going to use to measure the success. Is a key item, and it's actually one question I had jotted down for Mary Beth. Maybe I'll lob this one to you. It's how from a regulatory perspective, how can something like culture be measured, and is there a way that the regulators can reward those that are building and sustaining culture, and is there a way that subpar cultures can be penalized? And the one slide showed that a large percent wanted to do it, but a small percent felt they had it now, but wanted to move in that direction. How do they measure themselves along the way?
Well, I think when it comes to the regulatory bodies, they would like to measure it, obviously, and I think it's very difficult for them to do, but that won't stop them, mind you, from trying to do that. And I think you saw that with SOX and Dodd-Frank, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all, but they're going to make it a one-size-fits-all. However, I do think that organizations like ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, may start to creep into put tools, say you need to have so many, may say you need to report on your employee surveys or your customer surveys. They could start to, put that in their scoreboard, their score sheet that they evaluate public companies on it. But I think it's going to have to come down from, what do the institutional shareholders value culture? So when they're making an investment in a company, is it at their thought process, top of line, to have that as a screen? I don't know that we're there yet. And so I think there's a lot of unanswered questions because the metrics, just as you mentioned, one size doesn't fit all, Jeff, on that. But I think once you start having the millennials, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you aren't able to attract the top talent, no matter what sort of regulatory environment and hammer you have, they're going to, because your culture is not what they're looking for, they're going to go to other companies. And so then the result comes in your balance sheet. You're going to see it in the balance sheet. The regulatory environment does have certain hammers that they can use when you're not producing the right environment. but I don't think they're quite there yet. I think you're going to see ISS maybe get more involved and maybe have some points on their scorecard first, and then you'll see the regulatory environment start to get on the bandwagon and see how they can legislate it.
I have some questions from the audience. Can someone comment on how the internal audit team can contribute to and help the board with corporate culture?
I mean, I can talk briefly about the internal audit. You know, they are kind of the eyes and ears for the board. They report into the audit committee, and, they will do investigations for you. So I do think that they play a role. It's a tough role for them because they're an employee, too, of the company, and how you assess that. You don't want them being the police force out there, but you need to have the information with a balanced and position. Eileen, you may have more information on that, given Deloitte's position when it comes to internal auditors.
It's a great question. I think the role is changing, and an example of that is how much of a priority organizations are putting on education of their workforce. So it's not just to focus internal audit on after the issue is identified, but to more proactively try to reduce the number of issues that come up. So I think that we're seeing that role evolve and in a fabulous way, and I think it is an opportunity to reinforce the culture if the desired culture is one that you're seeking with more to encourage more courage for associates, for them to escalate issues more proactively, or courage in a way that would encourage them to address issues before they become or address risks before they become an issue. So I think that it's a great question because it is a very powerful group within the organization that can definitely shape culture.
Okay. Another question. Of the cultural challenges, of all of those challenges, is the primary role of the board of directors to find ways and means to align the company culture with the primary customer culture? For example, as Harley-Davidson has done?
I'm hesitant to say that it's a perfect alignment. I think it comes back to strategy, right? So for Harley-Davidson, it's completely on strategy for them to mirror their culture to their customers. So I would keep bringing the conversation back to what's the strategy and what's the culture that would need to be in place to drive that strategy. And then when it comes to the role of the board, what I commented on earlier that I think is worth just reinforcing is that depending on the size of the board, the size of the organization, and public or private, the board has more hands-on opportunity to shape culture versus influence and model behaviors and ask the right questions of the management team.
Okay. And then this was an interesting question. Given the information presented, the questioner says that seems to fit well with a relatively mature company, but how does this corporate culture presentation apply to a young company? Are there differences?
Well, I don't know. This is Mary Beth. I don't know that there's differences. You may not have the infrastructure in place to, maybe do the employee satisfaction survey because you're so small. You may know everybody in the room. However, the culture of that organization is what it is at that point, and if it's not an effective one for the shareholders or the stakeholders, if there's owner, if it's a really small privately held company, you still are, responsible to the owners of the company. And so the culture still has all the issues we've talked about. So you may not have all the wherewithal to do all the surveys and all that. You may just go around and ask the employees. So I think it's still, everything that we've talked about still applies. You know, you may not have an internal auditor, you know, so, you know, the CFO maybe has that role or whatever. So, you know, I think it still applies to everything we've talked about. Eileen, your thoughts on that, on a smaller organization?
I completely agree, and I love how you pointed out that it may actually be easier to assess because you can walk down the hall and talk to folks versus a multinational organization. You have to get more creative with data gathering. So I definitely concur.
Okay, Jim, that's it for our time and questions. Would you like to take us out?
Sure. Thank you, David. And on behalf of the Directors and Boards team, I want to thank Diligent for sponsoring today's webinar. A big thank you to Jeff Hilk for leading this informed briefing with the excellent participation of Mary Beth Vitale and Eileen Schreiber-Radis. And a hearty thank you to our listening audience for your time and attention today. I encourage you to watch your email for notice of future webinars and programs that Directors and Boards will be hosting in the coming months. Now let me turn this over to David to close us out. David?
Thank you. This does conclude today's event. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.